1. The Frostbitten Choir. It was the coldest December White Pine had experienced in over a century, the type of cold that burrowed deep into your bones and refused to let go. That night, Emma, a young widow, sat alone in her living room, sipping tea and trying to forget how quiet the house had become since her husband's passing the previous year. Suddenly, a soft, lilting melody floated through the air. She peered out of a frosted window to see a group of children in Victorian attire holding lanterns, their voices harmonizing in a hauntingly beautiful carol. Their pale faces were aglow in the icy moonlight, and their clothes seemed too light for the bitter cold. Yet they didn't shiver. Curious and somewhat comforted by the idea of human company, Emma opened her door and invited them inside. Children entered silently, their footsteps eerily absent on her hardwood floors. They gathered around her fireplace without speaking, their smiles frozen and their eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Feeling uneasy, Emma asked them where they were from, but they merely began humming the carol again, louder this time. Her discomfort grew as she noticed frost creeping along her walls, the fire struggling against an unnatural cold. One child, a small girl with golden curls and lifeless, glassy eyes, turned to Emma and whispered, "It's so warm here. Can we stay forever?" Emma's teacup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. She backed away, the temperature dropping so rapidly that her breath clouded in front of her face. When she tried to scream, her voice was swallowed by the cold. The last thing she saw was the children's mouths stretching impossibly wide, their song growing louder and louder and louder until it pierced her skull like an icy dagger. The next morning, neighbors found Emma's house entirely encased in frost, the windows opaque with ice. Inside there was no trace of her, only a life-sized ice sculpture of a woman, her face twisted in terror. Every December since, the Frostbitten Choir has returned. They knock on doors, their haunting melody a siren call for anyone foolish enough to listen too long. Those who invite them in are never seen again, but new, frozen statues always appear in the wake of their visits. 2. The Sleepless Forest. The old-growth forest surrounding Evergreen Ridge was treacherous, especially in winter. No one dared enter after dark, not even the seasoned hunters. Rumors claimed the woods were cursed. Stories of strange figures moving between the trees, shadowy hands reaching out from the snow-covered ground, and, most disturbingly, whispers that called you by name. One December, 20-year-old Brandon decided to test the legend. Armed with a flashlight and his father's hunting rifle, he ventured into the forest under the pretense of tracking a deer. But he had an ulterior motive. His older brother, Darren, had vanished in those woods a year ago to the day, and Brandon was desperate for answers. At first the forest was silent, the only sound the crunch of his boots in the snow. But then the whispers began. They came softly at first, indistinguishable from the wind. But soon they grew louder and more distinct. They called his name over and over, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of pleading and mocking tones. Brandon froze, his breath visible in the cold air. "Who's there?" he shouted. His voice echoed back, but it was joined by laughter, familiar laughter. Darren's laughter. Brandon ran deeper into the forest, following the sound despite every instinct telling him to turn back. He stumbled into a clearing where the snow was untouched, pristine except for a single set of footprints leading toward an enormous tree with roots twisted like claws. Hanging from the branches were dozens of crude human-like effigies made from sticks and twine. A figure stood beneath the tree, its back to Brandon. It wore Darren's jacket. "Darren," Brandon called, his voice cracking. The figure turned, and Brandon's stomach dropped. Before Brandon could respond, the ground beneath him gave way, and he was dragged into the snow by countless icy hands. He screamed, clawing at the surface, but the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was Darren's lifeless face staring down at him, a single tear frozen on his cheek. The next morning, search parties found Brandon's flashlight near the tree. His footprints led into the clearing but disappeared completely in the undisturbed snow. The legend of the sleepless forest grew, with locals whispering that the trees had claimed another soul. Some say if you listen closely on a winter's night, you can still hear Brandon calling for his brother, his voice lost in the wind. 3. The Icebound Prison. In a remote Alaskan town, a blizzard had raged for 3 straight days. The only refugee was the ancient lighthouse perched on a frozen cliff, its beams slicing through the endless white. 6 travelers, stranded by the storm, took shelter there, hoping to wait out the weather. Inside, the air was damp and cold, the walls thick with frost. The keeper, an elderly man named Elias, welcomed them with a grim expression. "You can stay," he said, "but don't go below the 3rd floor. And no matter what you hear, don't touch the ice." The travelers laughed nervously, assuming Elias was just a superstitious old man. But as night fell, strange things began to happen. One of them, a woman named Claire, noticed the walls seemed to breathe, the frost pulsing like veins beneath the surface. Another, Aaron, swore he heard whispers coming from the ice-coated staircase that led to the forbidden lower levels. Curiosity eventually got the better of them. Despite Elias's protests, they descended into the lighthouse's icy depths. The air grew colder with each step, their breaths crystallizing before their faces. At the bottom, they found a vast cavern, its walls glistening with a layer of frozen water. Trapped within the ice were human figures, hundreds of them, their faces twisted in agony. One of the travelers, Maya, reached out to touch the ice. The moment her fingers made contact, a deafening crack echoed through the cavern. The frozen figures began to move, their bodies jerking as if puppeteered by unseen string. Maya screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the howling wind as the ice shattered, releasing the figures from their prison. The last thing Elias heard from the lighthouse that night was the travelers' screams, followed by an unnatural silence. When the blizzard cleared, the lighthouse stood empty, its beam extinguished. Inside, searchers found only 6 new figures entombed in the ice, their faces frozen in terror. The lighthouse remains abandoned, but locals say on stormy nights, its beam occasionally flickers to life, and if you're unlucky enough to be near, you might hear the faint whispers of the icebound souls, waiting for their next victim. 4. The Snowman's Eyes. When 7-year-old Lily built a snowman in her backyard, it was the highlight of her winter. She gave it a scarf, a carrot nose, and 2 coal eyes. But something about those eyes unnerved her. They seemed to glimmer in the moonlight as if they were alive. That night, Lily woke to the sound of crunching snow outside her window. Peeking through the frosted glass, she gasped. The snowman was closer to the house, its coal eyes fixed on her room. She rubbed her eyes, thinking she must be dreaming, but when she looked again, it was even closer. The next day, her parents dismissed her story, laughing it off as a vivid imagination. But Lily noticed the snowman was back in its original spot, only now its smile was wider, its mouth curved into a sinister grin. As night fell, Lily heard the crunching again, louder this time. She locked her door and hid under the covers, but the sound of shattering glass made her heart stop. The last thing she saw was the snowman's coal eyes glowing in the darkness, its icy hand reaching for her. The next morning, all that remained of Lily was a small patch of disturbed snow and a new addition to the snowman, a crimson-stained scarf wrapped tightly around its neck. 5. The Frozen Graveyard. On the outskirts of a small snow-covered village in Norway stood a cemetery known as the Frozen Graveyard. No one buried their dead there anymore, but its chilling reputation lingered through generations. The villagers whispered that the dead in the frozen graveyard were not at rest, their icy tombs trapping their souls in eternal torment. On December 21st, the longest and darkest night of the year, Johann, a skeptical university student, decided to investigate the cemetery as part of his folklore research. Armed with a thermal jacket, a flashlight, and a recorder, he trudged through deep snow to the cemetery gates. The iron bars were twisted and coated in frost, as though something massive had clawed at them from the inside. Inside, rows of tombstones jutted from the snow like jagged teeth, their inscriptions barely legible beneath layers of ice. Johann recorded his observations, remarking how unnaturally cold it felt despite his thick clothing. As he walked deeper into the graveyard, he heard something, a faint whispering carried on the wind. He stopped and shined his flashlight around. The beam landed on a grave, its headstone broken in half. The ground in front of the grave was disturbed. The snow scattered as if something had been clawing its way out. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, a chorus of voices, all overlapping, calling his name. Johann's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay. "Hello," he called out, his breath fogging the air. The snow beneath his feet shifted. He jumped back as skeletal hands burst through the frozen ground, their fingers gnarled and frostbitten. One hand grabbed his ankle, and Johann screamed as he fell. The ground opened up around him, revealing an icy pit filled with frozen corpses. Their eyes glowed faintly blue, and their mouths moved in unison, chanting incomprehensible words. Johann clawed at the snow, desperate to pull himself out, but the hands dragged him down. The last thing he saw was a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the pit, its form indistinct, but its presence suffocating. The next day, villagers found Johann's backpack and recorder near the cemetery gates. On the recording, they heard his terrified screams, followed by the faint sound of laughter and a voice whispering, "One more for the grave." That night, a new headstone appeared in the graveyard, its inscription reading, "Johann, lost to the frost, 6, the glassy-eyed orphan." On a frigid December night, an orphanage at the edge of town went silent. No one knew why until morning, when the building was found empty, its halls eerily quiet and every door left wide open. The children's staff had vanished, leaving no trace but the lingering cold. Years later, a group of delinquent teens decided to spend a night in the abandoned orphanage as a dare. Armed with flashlights and a bottle of whiskey to keep warm, they joked about the rumors surrounding the place. Stories of restless spirits and children whose eyes glowed like glass marbles. The orphanage's interior was worse than they'd imagined. The walls were lined with frost, the wooden floorboards warped and creaking under their weight. A bitter cold seeped through their jackets as they wandered the halls, their breath visible in the air. In the main playroom, they found dusty toys scattered across the floor. One of the teens, Sarah, picked up a porcelain doll with cracked, lifeless eyes. As soon as she touched it, the temperature plummeted, and the faint sound of children laughing filled the room. "What the hell was that?" asked Kyle, the group's leader. The laughter grew louder, and the teens spun around to see shadowy figures forming in the corners of the room. They were children. At least they looked like children, but their eyes were shiny and glassy, reflecting the faint moonlight. Their mouths opened unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Sarah dropped the doll and screamed as one of the figures lunged at her, its icy hands wrapping around her throat. The others ran, but the hallway stretched endlessly, the doors slamming shut as they passed. By morning, only Sarah's body was found, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The others were never seen again. To this day, the orphanage remains untouched, but locals swear they hear the sound of glassy laughter on cold December nights. 7. The December Diary. In 1947, a young woman named Margaret found an old leather-bound diary while cleaning out her grandmother's attic. Its cover was cracked with age, and the pages were yellowed, but the entries were vivid, describing a bitterly cold December during the 1800s. The diary's writer, a girl named Anna, described her family's struggles during an unusually harsh winter. Crops had failed, animals froze to death, and starvation loomed. But as Margaret read further, the entries took a darker turn. Anna wrote about a mysterious stranger who appeared at their cabin, offering warmth and food in exchange for a simple promise. They must always keep the fire burning. At first, the family agreed. The stranger left, and their cabin inexplicably filled with warmth. But Anna wrote that the fire demanded more than wood to stay alive. The flames whispered to her at night, urging her to make sacrifices. Final entry chilled Margaret to her core. The fire must not go out. It's so hungry now. Mother was first. Father will be next. Then my brothers. I think it will take me last. As Margaret finished reading, the temperature in the attic dropped. Her breath fogged in front of her, and the faint smell of smoke filled the air. Turning, she saw a flickering light at the edge of the room, a fire burning in midair, its flames unnaturally bright. The fire whispered her name. By morning, Margaret's family found the attic door frozen shut. When they finally broke it open, they found only ash and the diary, untouched, lying in the center of the room. The diary reappears every December, passed from person to person, its story unfinished, and its fire hungry for more. 8. The Winter Watcher. In the remote mountains of Montana, a solitary park ranger named Owen was stationed at a cabin near Glacier Ridge during December. His job was to monitor wildlife and ensure no hikers ventured into the dangerous terrain during the brutal winter. Owen didn't mind the isolation until he began to notice strange footprints in the snow. They were human but enormous, each step spaced impossibly far apart, as if whatever made them had an unnatural gait. At first he dismissed them as a trick of the wind or snow, but each night the prints grew closer to his cabin. On the fourth night he heard a low, guttural growl outside his window. Grabbing his rifle, Owen peered outside but saw nothing. When dawn broke, he found deep claw marks on the cabin door, and the footprints now circled the building. Whatever it was, it had been watching him. The next night, the growling returned, accompanied by scratching at the walls. Owen barricaded himself inside, his heart pounding as the creature's shadow passed across his frosted window. Then came the voice, a rasping, inhuman whisper. "Let me in, Owen." By morning, the ranger station received an incomplete distress call from Owen. When rescuers arrived, they found his cabin empty, the door ripped from its hinges. Blood and deep claw marks covered the snow outside, but there were no tracks leading away from the scene. Some say the Winter Watcher still roams the mountains, searching for those foolish enough to be alone on a December night. 9. The Snowbound Mirror. On the morning of December 13th, Natalie discovered an ornate full-length mirror buried beneath layers of snow in her backyard. She couldn't explain how it got there. It wasn't hers, and the nearest neighbors lived miles away. Still, the intricate frosted carvings along its gilded frame were mesmerizing, and she decided to bring it inside. Natalie placed the mirror in her living room, marveling at how perfectly it reflected her Christmas decorations. That night, as she passed by it on her way to bed, something about her reflection seemed off. She stopped and stared, noticing that her mirrored self wasn't copying her movements exactly. It blinked slower, turned its head slightly differently, and at one point smirked when she wasn't smiling. "Just the lighting," Natalie muttered, brushing off her unease. The next day she found footprints in the snow outside her house, bare human footprints. They led from her front door to her living room window, then vanished. When she checked the mirror, she noticed something horrifying. There were faint, frostbitten handprints on the inside of the glass. That night, the strange reflection returned. This time, it didn't move at all. When Natalie waved her hand, the reflection stood perfectly still, staring back at her with cold, dead eyes. Then, it moved. It stepped forward, pressing its hand against the inside of the mirror. "Let me out," it whispered. It whispered, its voice muffled but unmistakable. Terrified, Natalie tried to cover the mirror with a blanket. When she turned away, she heard the sound of glass cracking. The mirror's surface began to splinter, and the reflection grinned as it pushed against the fragile barrier. Natalie fled to her bedroom, locking the door. She could hear the mirror shatter, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. "I'm free," a voice sang, its tone gleeful and menacing. The next morning, a neighbor found Natalie's house eerily quiet. When they entered, they found no sign of her, only the shattered remains of the mirror, its shards coated in frost. To this day, the mirror is said to reappear in random places, always seeking a new victim to free its sinister inhabitant. 10. The Black Blizzard. In the remote town of Frosthaven, a blizzard struck with an intensity no one had ever seen before. The snowstorm turned the sky pitch black, blocking out the moon and stars. Townspeople locked their doors and windows, praying it would pass quickly. But as the hours dragged on, strange noises echoed through the streets. Low, guttural growls, whispers that sounded like children's laughter, and the distinct sound of claws scraping against wood. Samuel, the town's only doctor, ventured out into the storm after receiving a frantic phone call from a family down the road. They claimed something was trying to break into their home, armed with a lantern and a shotgun. Samuel trudged through the blinding snow, barely able to see a foot in front of him. When he arrived at the house, he found the door hanging open and the snow inside stained red. A trail of bloody footprints led upstairs. Samuel followed them, calling out for the family. He reached the children's bedroom, where the footprints ended abruptly in front of a window that was still locked from the inside. As he turned to leave, he heard a faint scratching sound. Looking closer, he saw that the children's drawings on the walls had changed. Stick figure depictions of their family were now replaced with monstrous, shadowy figures. Beneath them, scrawled in a child's handwriting, were the words, "They came from the blizzard." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as he heard the front door slam shut. He ran downstairs, but the house was empty. Outside, the blizzard roared louder than ever. As he stepped back into the storm, he saw dozens of shadowy figures moving through the snow, their glowing eyes fixed on him. The next day, when the blizzard cleared, Frosthaven was silent. Every house was empty, their doors blown open. The only sign of life was a single message carved into the snow in front of the doctor's office. The storm always takes what it needs. 11. The Snow Globe Curse. Mina found the snow globe at a second-hand shop, tucked away on a dusty shelf. Its tiny scene of a quaint cabin surrounded by pine trees reminded her of her late grandmother's house, and she bought it on impulse. When she shook it that night, something strange happened. The flakes inside the globe moved unnaturally, as if caught in an invisible wind. The cabin's windows flickered with light, though there were no batteries or mechanisms inside. As the snow settled, Mina noticed a small figure standing outside the cabin in the globe. A shadowy person who hadn't been there before. Shrugging it off as a trick of her imagination, she placed the snow globe on her bedside table and went to sleep. At 3 a.m., Mina awoke to the sound of crunching snow. Groggily, she looked outside but saw nothing. Then she turned to the snow globe and froze. The shadowy figure inside the globe had moved closer to the cabin, its form more defined. It now resembled a man with long limbs and hollow eyes. Panicked, Mina shook the globe violently. The figure disappeared, but the lights in the cabin flickered brighter. She swore she could hear faint knocking coming from the globe. Over the next few days, Mina noticed strange things in her house. Wet footprints on the hardwood floor, a faint smell of pine, and the sensation of being watched. Each night, the figure in the globe moved closer to the cabin's door. On the 7th night, Mina awoke to find the figure standing at the globe's cabin door. its face pressed against the tiny window. The knocking she heard this time wasn't from the globe. It was coming from her front door. Police found the snow globe on her floor, shattered into pieces. The scene inside was gone, replaced by a swirling black void. Mina was never seen again, but the globe reappeared in the same shop weeks later, pristine and waiting for its next owner. 12. The Choir of Shadows. Every December, the small town of Grey Hollow held its annual caroling tradition. On the coldest night of the month, a choir of local singers walked through the streets, singing old hymns to celebrate the season. This year, however, an eerie silence fell over the town. The usual choir was absent, replaced by whispers of a new group of carolers who sang only after midnight. Their songs were not the joyful melodies Grey Hollow was accustomed to, but haunting, wordless harmonies that drifted on the icy wind. Their voices were deep and otherworldly, sending shivers down the spines of those who dared to listen. Emily, a journalist new to Grey Hollow, decided to investigate the strange choir. On December 23rd, she stayed up past midnight, bundled in a heavy coat, and waited by her window. Just after the clock struck 12, she heard it, a low, droning hum that grew louder and more intricate as it echoed through the streets. Stepping outside, Emily spotted the carolers for the first time. They were clad in long black cloaks that dragged through the snow, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. Their procession was slow and deliberate, their song growing louder as they passed. But as Emily watched, she realized something was wrong. The snow beneath their feet didn't crunch. Their cloaks didn't move in the wind. And when she stepped closer, she saw that their faces weren't hidden by hoods. They were featureless, blank as porcelain masks. Emily tried to retreat, but the choir stopped and turned toward her, their song morphing into a piercing wail that drowned out her screams. The next morning, her neighbors found only a trail of footprints leading to the edge of town, where they vanished into the snow. Now, each December, the Choir of Shadows returns to Grey Hollow, and those who hear their song are never seen again. 13. The December Doppelganger. In the small, snow-covered town of Ravendale, a terrifying legend haunted the locals every December. The story of the December Doppelganger. It was said that during the longest nights of the year, a shadowy double of yourself could appear, mimicking your every move until it took your place. Maggie, a single mother, thought it was just an old folktale meant to scare children, until one bitterly cold evening when her son, Caleb, pointed out something strange in the window. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling, "why are you outside?" Maggie froze. She turned to the window and saw herself standing in the snow, staring back at her. The figure wore the same clothes she had on, but its expression was cold and lifeless. Its movements were jerky, as if it were learning how to mimic her. Grabbing Caleb, Maggie locked all the doors and pulled the curtains shut, but the doppelganger didn't stop. It began knocking on the windows, each tap in perfect rhythm with Maggie's heartbeat. "Let me in," it said in her voice, but the tone was hollow and wrong, like someone imitating her without understanding human emotion. Maggie stayed awake all night, clutching Caleb in her arms, but as dawn broke, she realized the knocking had stopped. Gathering her courage, she opened the door to find nothing but untouched snow. Relieved, she sent Caleb to school and tried to go about her day. But when she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her heart sank. The woman in the mirror didn't blink when she did. It smiled, a slow, twisted grin before mouthing the words, "I'm already inside." By the time Caleb came home that evening, his mother was gone. In her place stood someone who looked like her, but didn't feel like her. And every December, Ravendale whispers about the family that vanished, leaving only eerie smiles in their photographs. 14. The Icebound Hotel. Deep in the snowy wilderness of Alaska stood the Crystal Haven, a luxurious hotel abandoned decades ago after a series of mysterious disappearances. Though it was officially closed, rumors persisted that light still flickered in its windows and shadows moved through its icy hall. On a dare, 4 friends, Evan, Julia, Marcus, and Rachel, decided to spend a night in the infamous hotel. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they snowmobiled to the frozen structure, the bitter wind biting at their faces. Inside, the air was unnaturally cold, and frost clung to the walls like cobwebs. The lobby was eerily pristine, as though the staff had left in the middle of their duties. Plates of food, long frozen, sat on tables, and the faint sound of music echoed through the hall. The group explored cautiously, their laughter fading as the oppressive atmosphere weighed on them. In one room they found a mirror that reflected not themselves, but a bustling hotel lobby filled with elegantly dressed guests. The guests turned to look at them, their faces pale and frozen in grotesque grins. Panicked, they tried to leave, but the door to the lobby was gone, replaced by a solid wall of ice. The temperature dropped further, and their breaths froze in the air. One by one, the friends began to vanish. First, Marcus disappeared while searching for an exit. Julia and Evan found his flashlight lying in the snow, its beam pointing toward a frosted window. Rachel, desperate, ran into a corridor, only to find herself trapped in a room with walls that closed in on her, the ice growing thicker by the second. Evan, the last remaining, stumbled into the dining hall, where he found his friends frozen in ice sculptures, their faces contorted in terror. The music grew louder, and the ghostly guests from the mirror appeared around him, their cold hands reaching out. By morning, the Crystal Haven was silent again. The friends were never seen, but local pilots claim they still see lights flickering in its windows on dark December nights.